until FAIR, there didn't seem to be a concerted effort to raise the question whether a democracy can exist if a couple dozen corporations control most of the media. That's not the pluralism that the founding fathers intended. It's not the pluralism that you find in Western Europe. So I'd say our main success has been raising the issue of corporate domination of the media. And I don't have to be flip to say that giant corporations are generally not left-wing institutions. And when you've always heard for so many decades the right-wing critique of the media as being left-wing, I think it's a little silly when General Electric owns NBC, when half of the board members of the New York Times are also on the boards of directors of major military contractors. That was reported by Columbia Journalism Review. When you see who really owns the media and the interlock between the media and the military-industrial complex, you begin to see a media that's really a big part of the establishment.
Hello, everyone. I am Kevin Gosztola, and welcome to the Dissenter Update. This edition of the Dissenter Update, which is part of the Dissenter newsletter over at thedissenter.org. We cover press freedom, whistleblowers, and government secrecy. And if you are a paid subscriber, you're very familiar with the work of the Dissenter Update. We took a little bit of a break there, took some time off. That clip that introduced this show is of Jeff Cohen. He is the co-founder of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. That was him back in the 1980s during the era of Ronald Reagan, when the flagship media criticism organization was started by Jeff Cohen. He's my guest for this week on the show, and I'd wanted him to come on for several weeks. Now we finally were able to line up their schedules and make it happen. And particularly, I asked him to address, because he's been paying attention, the corporate media capitulation, the acquiescence by media executives. We've been seeing how they'll put their profits and their businesses before or ahead of preserving freedom of the press and our First Amendment rights. They've enabled political attacks on journalism by Trump and his administration by settling these frivolous lawsuits that would be absolutely laughable in a courtroom, concocting these legal theories that have no basis whatsoever, but then getting mileage because these executives that are not invested in journalism, they're invested in how to further their businesses, which are not always limited. Usually they're not limited to broadcasting or publishing. They have other ventures that are connected as well that they have to look after. They have mergers that they want, as in the case of Paramount and Skydance. So they settle. They basically allow a kind of bribery to force them to kneecap or undermine the work that their own journalists, whether they're on television or they're involved in newspapers, they undermine their professional work by settling with Donald Trump. They tarnish any kind of integrity that those organizations may have had. And obviously, I'm well aware that if we're talking about corporate media or establishment media institutions, that they have done quite a bit over the last decades to lose trust from people like us. And yet they still have the right to exercise freedom of the press. They still do, to some degree, speak up for journalists when they're under attack, except when they can't. If the executives who run those businesses, those conglomerates, are telling them that they have to sit silently and make deals with Donald Trump. So Jeff Cohen was on the show, and he's somebody who was in cable news for several years. He wrote a book called Cable News Confidential that we talk a little bit about his time being an analyst on CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC. He was part of the big three. Before I get to that interview, though, just a few words about this podcast, about some of the stuff that's been going on over the last few months with it. And again, I want to say thank you for being a supporter of the Dissenter update. We took a little bit of time off the Dissenter newsletter. I paused subscriptions. There were fewer articles published. I had a couple projects to complete. One of them with the Freedom of the Press Foundation. I worked as a contractor. I'm looking forward to being able to share this report that I put together in the next 6 months or so. There's a lot to be done with it still, but that was part of the reason why there was a lull. And I'm a little disappointed. There were a handful of paid subscribers who left when I turned the subscriptions back on. And I had really hoped that I wouldn't see that happen right away because of the fact that I kept producing the Dissenter update, even as I published fewer articles as part of the Dissenter newsletter. I continued to actually produce podcast episodes during the time that I was also juggling these projects. And I think I'm feeling the fact that this show is being built up from scratch after unauthorized disclosure, after I had a fairly successful podcast that had an identity. I did that for over 10 years. I had a good partner for most of the time that I was producing the show. And we were able to engage with and build up a rather good audience. I think that's gone by the wayside. And with the change in algorithms and how it's really difficult to introduce people to your show and build up an audience, the small, tiny group of people that do support this podcast, I can I can feel that I'm going to come dangerously close to squeezing and squeezing whatever they have to give, and that there might be a feeling that I'm being ungrateful, or that I shouldn't be leaning on them because they already do quite enough. And also to apply pressure when they already are supporters of the show. And I don't want this to come off as like I'm scolding or lecturing you, but in independent media right now, it is incredibly difficult to produce your shows and get them to an audience that I think justifies the kind of time or the labor that goes into producing this podcast. For this week's episode, when I recorded the interview with Jeff Cohen, you'll notice there's a lag, and I'll call it out right now so that you understand it's not a glitch. It's not something that's happening with Google. Google isn't through YouTube trying to censor the content of the show. There's not a buffering issue. It's not your internet connection. It was Jeff Cohen, and I had very clean audio. And so, on one hand, I could have gone old school. I could have just put out the show, the episode where people could listen. But I took the opportunity to actually spend several extra hours, and I collected some clips. And I think it makes the conversation more engaging. It makes the lagging a bit more, a bit less distracting, although it is still there. There's not really anything I can do about it. And I do hope that you appreciate the about 45, 50 minutes or so of our conversation that we have that really addresses the state of the press right now and what these corporate media institutions are doing to play into the destructive politics of our present moment. Uh, I'll just say that when I ask people to support the Dissenter update or the Dissenter newsletter, I have a definite hang up. I think a lot of people do in independent journalism, and I'll make this pitch. If you're in good health, I want you to take care of your health. If you're in good health, if you have financial security, if you feel like you have secure employment, then I make an appeal to people like you and others, your friends, your family, people who do recognize the problems that we discuss in this episode. I make a pitch to you to give just a few bucks every month to help build up this podcast. And if you don't have those things, and I'm sorry that you don't, then you don't have to feel pressured to support the show. You can just watch it for free. There are other ways to support shows without giving. You can share the podcast, and that always is a tremendous benefit for people like us seeing it in different spaces. If you have any ability to generate conversation about the show, that's always good too. And from there on, organically by word of mouth, there's a chance that the podcast will be listened to or watched by more people. But it's difficult to ask the small group that already gives to give more. And so I'm not doing that today. I really want you to understand that I'm not doing that today. And if something happens and you can't subscribe to the show anymore and pay, I understand. Uh, and I'll keep toiling and pushing forward to build this up. And I hope I get to the point where I am more confident in what is being pieced together here with this show. The ideas I've experimented, and it was a weekly show. Now it's a bi-weekly show, just based on the small amount of time that I have to do the show. I'm not sure that there is a show quite like this out there, though I'm familiar that there are other media freedom or press freedom outfits that have conversations like this with important and influential people. Uh, but I wanted to have this be a thing that people could stay up on the news of what is taking place and how it affects our ability to address corruption, whether it is among government agencies or within corporate institutions. And I think that we've done a pretty good job. I just don't know that we've been able to put the material in front of enough faces so that they are able to read and digest and recognize some of this. So we just keep working. It's the job of independent journalists to keep trying to get their stuff before as many people as possible to have an impact. We don't have the advantage that comes from being in a corporate media institution, but then we have integrity. Then we have legitimacy, we have credibility. I think I've built up credibility over the last decade. I hope that this isn't something that I had to say today from my heart that has discouraged you from supporting my work. I hope you feel like it is well meaning and that it dovetails with where we're going here, and leading into this discussion with Jeff Cohen. I think this has a bit of a harmony with what I am discussing with Jeff Cohen in today's episode. So let's get to Jeff Cohen and our interview. I said way more than I had ever intended. But, I guess after being on hiatus for a month, it's okay to just go off and give you this monologue. Thank you for being here. And here's the interview with Jeff Cohen. Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Jeff Cohen, who I've known and followed his work for a long time as a media critic. And I hope I get this introduction right. You're the co-founder of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. You're with Roots Action right now as a co-founder. Welcome. Thank you for coming to chat.
Nice to be with you.
I wanted you on to speak about the nature of corporate media capitulation, which I know you had a chance to say a lot about when we learned that Stephen Colbert was not going to be able to continue to hold his show. Before we get too far into our conversation, before we even really get going, and I have you chime in, why don't you just speak about how you come to this work? I don't want to presume that people who listen to us will actually know you, and I want them to just understand that you've been doing this for 40 plus years now, that you've been doing this kind of work.
Yeah. So I came out of the 1960s. I was an anti-Vietnam War protester and civil rights activist. I was briefly in Los Angeles an ACLU attorney. I did a lot of journalism for the independent progressive press, which often was called the underground press. And then in the early 80s, I became sort of a publicist in Los Angeles. I was well known for progressive causes. And I taught how to get mainstream media coverage and other media coverage of your movements and your groups and your nonprofit causes. And then in 1986 is when I founded FAIR.
I think the huge turnout reveals the intense frustration and anger that is felt by progressive thinking Americans with the media 7 years into the Reagan administration. We need to come away from this conference with new resolve that it is too late for activists to grumble to each other quietly about the media. Whether you are active in the fight to stop the U.S. war against Central America or the nuclear arms race, whether you're active in efforts to save the environment or to work for economic rights for the poor and the homeless, whether you're active in the consumer movement or the labor movements that work against corporate greed and corporate merger, you know that your viewpoints are generally excluded from the mainstream media. Instead of complaining to each other, it's time that activists began to confront the media directly, began to challenge media bias directly, and that's what FAIR is all about.
FAIR was an effort to politicize what every activist talked about, which is their constant grumbling about mainstream media, about bias, about censorship. They didn't cover our protest. We had thousands of people at City Hall, and I thought instead of just being one of the many grumblers about how bad corporate mainstream media was, I would form this group called FAIR, where we would politicize the issue of corporate media bias, corporate concentration. 60 years ago, the New Yorker's press critic, A.J. Liebling, he wrote, "Freedom of the press is guaranteed only to those who own one." It's the privilege of the owner, not the public, not necessarily even the journalists who work for the owner. But, if you own a press, then you'll have freedom of the press. And as the media have concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer, ever bigger corporations, I think most people have been seeing freedom of the press shrink. Like you mentioned in your intro, these corporate owners that are capitulating, they don't care about journalism. Disney owns ABC. They couldn't give a damn about journalism. It's a tiny part of what they do. They're an entertainment conglomerate. They're a distraction conglomerate. CBS is owned by Paramount and now Skydance Paramount because of the new merger you referenced. These corporations are giant. They care only about one thing, which is profit maximization. The only journalists I trust are independent ones, especially the ones who don't have big corporate bosses, those who don't work for giant media conglomerates. Because I left out of my biography, in the late 80s and 90s and into the early aughts, I was on all three cable news channels as a paid analyst. So I've seen these places from the inside. News is a commodity. News is entertainment. News is a ratings grab. News is don't offend powerful interests that might hurt us. So that's why in 2008, I took a job in Ithaca College as a associate journalism professor and the founding director of the Park Center for Independent Media, where for 10 years we studied the real journalism that was booming in that era. You were part of it. You were a blogger on these important big issues. And thanks to the internet, independent, non-corporate, non-conglomerated media were booming in the years I was at Ithaca College from 2008 to 2018. Now Mickey Huff of Project Censored is the director of that important center. But that's where the real journalism is going on, is these independents. Now, it's not easy to make a living if you're an independent, but you certainly don't go into work, as I did when I was at MSNBC in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq. You know, I would go into work wondering what stupid order for censorship am I going to get from the bosses at MSNBC and NBC News. If you're an independent, you don't get paid so well, but you don't have to worry about some corporate owner or sponsor censoring you. So yeah, we're in a very horrible bind. You referenced it in the last 7 months. These media conglomerates have unmasked themselves. They don't care about freedom of the press. They don't care about journalism. All they care about is profits. So Disney and a suit they couldn't possibly have lost, a defamation suit from Trump. They gave what amounted to a thinly veiled bribe to the Trump library, presidential library that does not exist, $16 million to settle a defamation suit they could not lose. Then Meta, which owns Instagram and Facebook, they settled a suit they couldn't lose, which was everyone knew they had these guidelines well publicized. If, you know, you can basically get away with a lot on Facebook or Instagram, but you can't incite violence. So after January 6th, they suspended Trump. They had the perfect right to do it. But after Trump won the re-election in 2024, Zuckerberg, the CEO of Meta, goes down to Mar-a-Lago. They pay $1 million to the inaugural fund. And then they give him a $25 million bribe to settle the lawsuit. Hey, you took me off of Facebook. And, you know, the argument, of course, in court, they would have won. Facebook, Meta would have won. You violated a guideline that we had publicized quite clearly. We didn't do it frivolously. We abided by our guidelines. And then the latest thinly veiled bribe, perhaps even more ludicrous, was Trump arguing that 60 Minutes, CBS, which is owned by Paramount, now owned by Paramount Skydance, that in the editing of the Kamala Harris interview before the 2024 election, they somehow committed consumer fraud. This would have been laughed out of court. The lawyers for Paramount said this is utterly meritless, but because they wanted to merge with Skydance and the FCC was holding it up, and we know why they were holding it up. They were holding it up so that Paramount would clamp down on 60 Minutes, which they did. The head of 60 Minutes resigned politically, Bill Owens. His boss then resigned, the CEO of CBS News. And, you know, CBS News, it was never great, but it was the gold standard for broadcast news. It's utterly devastated. And then to make sure that the merger would be approved at the FCC, they settled a lawsuit, Paramount, that they couldn't possibly lose. They paid $16 million to Trump's non-existent presidential library. And then soon after, the Federal Communications Commission, which is now a slugging arm for Trump. It's never been that. The FCC has never, they're having investigations of the major broadcast networks over bias. It's never happened before in the decades. You know, I think the Federal Communications Commission was originally Federal Radio Commission. I mean, this started 90 years ago. It's never happened. And Trump has turned it, with the FCC chair, Brendan Carr, into basically a censorship operation. And I should say, in winding up this long-winded answer, the reason that we're totally worried about Paramount is not only have they terminated Colbert's show after Colbert referred to it as a big fat bribe accurately, Paramount also owns Comedy Central, which, you know, The Daily Show is a really important voice of dissent in our country. And its days may be numbered in terms of weeks or months for all we know. And the new owner of CBS and Comedy Central is now Skydance. Skydance, the money to take over Paramount came from Larry Ellison, a co-founder of Oracle. And after the falling out between Musk and Trump, Larry Ellison is the billionaire who's more Trump-like, closest to Trump of any billionaire alive. And his son also is one of these Israel right or wrong freaks. And so was Sherry Redstone, who owned Paramount. And when the Paramount merger went through, she was $2 billion richer on that day. And she was an Israel right or wrong freak. And I know, Kevin, you've been an advocate, a wonderful advocate for whistleblowers and the journalists and publishers who use whistleblowers. Well, one of the things that rattled Sherry Redstone, the owner of Paramount, and why she was interfering in CBS 60 Minutes is because they did a pretty good report about two State Department officials who had resigned over the Gaza massacres under Biden and became whistleblowers. And 60 Minutes did a very effective, very persuasive report. And Sherry Redstone was pissed. You're going to see less and less of that in corporate mainstream media, which is why if you're a serious news consumer, you've got to turn off Fox News, turn off MSNBC, turn off CBS, and turn on to the independent media that actually do journalism, that check their facts, that do tough analysis. That's where the real journalism is happening today.
When I hear you speak, I think about how there's this film called The Insider. And as I saw what had unfolded over the last 6 or 7 months, I couldn't help but think that there was a kind of sequel being written to it, that if you jumped forward, you could, explore it. For people who may not be familiar with, this is a Russell Crowe film that follows Jeffrey Wigand when he blows the whistle on big tobacco. And 60 Minutes is basically embarrassed by the fact that they won't air this report. And they actually don't really air the interview that they record with this whistleblower in the end. They do their own kind of story about the story, in effect. And, now today it's like, you had resignations from 60 Minutes by some people who wanted to say, I have some principles left after all these years, and I'm not going to tolerate this. And you are seeing in some of these institutions, not just media, but also government, that there are some people with a little bit of backbone left that are resigning. I know in your book you mentioned that you became a media critic after following the war in Vietnam. And I would say that I started to care about media reform when we'll call it Iraq War II was unfolding. I don't think it's an accident that people see those wars happen, or anytime that there's a war that happens, that's when you get to most see the flaws and all the, I don't want to call them weaknesses, but everything that is wrong with media just is so much more glaring when war is being put on. Of course, now what we've been talking about is the political climate with who is in power. And I think that's sort of different, because when we're talking about war, it hasn't really mattered political party wise what was implicated. That was just the MO, the way that things would unfold with media. But now you throw in a Trump, not only do you have what would typically happen when covering wars, so what Israel's been doing with its bombardment of Gaza, its occupation, the starvation, the famine that is being inflicted, but then you now have to throw in Trump in there. You throw in a figure like Brendan Carr, who's making these threats. It just creates these even more greater pressures on journalists. And, if you look around, I can't imagine a more stressful time to be a journalist in media in the last 20, 30 years.
No doubt. I mean, and it's always tough during war to be a journalist if your boss is the conglomerate. I was at MSNBC in the run up to the Iraq invasion, and I wrote about it in the book Behind You, Cable News Confidential, that if you work for these conglomerates during a time of war, they're all interlocked. Their sponsors are military contractors often. Their board members are with military contractors. That's what people need to understand, that journalism should be a public good. It can't be a public good, and democracy requires real journalism. It requires accurate information so that the voters, the electorate, the citizens can decide things. That's the theory of democracy. Our democracy is breaking down because the media has been breaking down for decades. And as you say, breaking down more intensely in the last 6-7 months. You came to understand that you couldn't trust mainstream media during the Iraq invasion and war, and me during the Vietnam War. For many people who wise up to why they can't trust corporate mainstream media, it often is personal. But not enough people are feeling the personal affront. When workers go out on strike, they realize, oh, this newspaper I've been reading all these years just is biased against workers. So when people are personally involved, they can see the bias clearly, and that's when they become media critics and media skeptics. But we've been building in this direction for decades. I started FAIR in the 1980s during the Reagan administration. And that's when all there were just 3 TV broadcast channels, CBS, NBC, and ABC. All 3 of them had ownership changes. And they were getting taken over by bigger and bigger companies. And all of this should have been illegal under the antitrust laws that are on the books. But antitrust has basically been non-enforceable for 45 years. People think that it's inevitable that a few corporations will take over any industry. It's not inevitable if the antitrust laws are enforced. And they're especially important to enforce in the media area. And I remember the FCC, Federal Communications Commission chair, probably the worst one until we got Trump's FCC czar, who's a censorship czar, Brendan Carr. We had a guy for Reagan, Fowler, and he said, why regulate television in the public interest? It's just like a toaster with pictures. And it was basically, let's let these companies merge and merge and merge, let them do what they want, make everything even more commercialized. There used to be all sorts of restrictions on what media could do if they own the public's airwaves. And every law case has said till today, I don't know how long this will last, but for decade after decade, that the broadcast airwaves, TV and radio airwaves, are every bit as much public property as the national parks, Yosemite and Yellowstone. They're public property. So there used to be restrictions on what these companies could do with public property. That all started going out the window with Reagan. Clinton made it worse. Obama was bad. And now we've gotten to Brendan Carr, appointed by Trump, where the Federal Communications Commission is a slugging arm against journalism on behalf of Trump. He's wielding the FCC with threats, and we're going to investigate, and you've got to turn over all the transcripts of the interview, all the footage of your interview with Kamala Harris. It's never happened in the history. We have something called the First Amendment, and that's out the window. That's why I laugh when I hear right-wingers who claim to be for free speech or free press, and they've seemed to have gone silent on what Trump's been doing, many of them.
Yeah, and connected to this unprincipled stance on free speech, or the phoniness of it, let's get to the systematic defunding of public media, or the whole concept that government could be funded by the or that the media could be supported and bolstered by the government. And then it was like what has unfolded in the last 6 or 7 months. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but having followed the work of FAIR, I feel pretty confident in saying that there was this right-wing project over the last 30 years to totally disembowel PBS so that they could have no effect. They were pretty good from the beginning at actually making it subservient to Republicans. But I think the most frustrating thing about this, in addition to the fact that people might not care about fighting for public funding of media institutions anymore, is that, as FAIR documented, year after year, decade after decade, PBS and NPR would populate their programs with people who actually help facilitate the very attacks on their organization that now leave them defunded.
Public broadcasting in our country has always been weak, especially public television. If you go to European countries and other countries, Japan, the most powerful television channels are public. And unlike ours, where our system was set up in the 60s, public television that used to be called educational television. And there was a blue ribbon Carnegie Commission that said, yeah, you have to fund public broadcasting with insulated funds. Perhaps everyone that owns a television, or every time you buy a television, you pay a tax, and it's got to be insulated. It can't be appropriated every year by Congress. And that's what was recommended. But Lyndon Johnson, then the president, and one of the Dixiecrat senators said, we're not going to do this unless we get to appropriate every year. So in other countries, there's insulated funding that goes to public broadcasters. And the prime minister of the country can complain about BBC or whatever, but the funding is automatic. That's why in many, many other countries, public television is quite good and big. And the news on public television raises the level of TV news so that even the private channels, there didn't used to be any, but now there's a lot. The private channels often have decent news because public television in that country has set the standard for it. So we always had weak public television. And the Republicans have always weakened it by threatening to cut off the funding, which they never did until now. And so now you're going to see rural communities lose their NPR station, lose their PBS station. In terms of NPR, they only get a tiny percentage of their money through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is what's been zeroed out. And NPR could, in theory, get a little better, but I think they're so used to this being timid, not breaking big stories, not challenging corporate prerogatives, and both sides, this idea that you have to put the official lie next to the truth, sometimes bigger than the truth. That's what a lot of the both sidesism is in corporate mainstream media, and I include NPR. So, you would hope that with them no longer getting federal money through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, NPR would get better. That's the hope. But here's the reality, and you always hear this from the right wing, that if we have big, powerful public broadcasting, the government will run things. Well, the reality is that Reporters Without Borders, which is a great press freedom organization globally, they rank order what countries have the most press freedom every year. And those are also the countries where there's more taxpayer money that goes to public broadcasting than everywhere else. It's a direct corollary. So, Bob McChesney, the great media scholar who just passed away, his wife's from Norway. He would go to Norway every year, and he would see Norway government, again, insulated funding to public television, public radio, and newspapers and websites, irrespective of whether these are right-wing, left-wing. It's insulated funding. It goes to everyone, irrespective of content. And that's why you have better journalism in those places. It isn't where all the main journalists in society have to work for a giant conglomerate. Because of public funding, taxpayer funding, these journalists have more freedom to inform the public. And because the funding is insulated and the parliaments can't turn it on and turn it off, it gives journalists who receive taxpayer money a lot more freedom. And, I could give you, a few years ago, there was a survey in Germany. The amount of tax money per person that went to public broadcasting was $140 per person. Scandinavian countries, about $100 per person. In Britain, which is famously mostly the BBC, but other channels, $80 per person tax money going to public broadcasting. Japan and Spain, $55. Canada, the CBC, $27. In our country, it was between $3 and $4. And now it's going to be basically close to zero. But we've always had weakened public broadcasting. It's always been intimidated. And that's because the funding was not insulated. The hope is, you mentioned Free Press, the great media reform group. You can find them at freepress.net. You can find FAIR, the media criticism group, at fair.org. But freepress.net, with public broadcasting being X'd out at the federal level, will have the dream we've always had. We need to construct public broadcasting, reconstruct it, recreate it with an insulated public trust that the politicians cannot get their hands on. That's how it's done in other countries. It's not rocket science. It's actually mainstream in many other countries. I'll give you a one footnote, and then I'll shut off my long-winded answer. I also make co-produce documentary films. We made one about independent journalists called All Governments Lie, and it was What's Wrong with Corporate Mainstream Media. We made the next movie, What's Wrong with the Political Economy, called Corporate Coup d'etat. These movies are about the US politics, US media. They can't be shown on public television here, but they've been shown on public television in Brazil, in Japan, in Germany, in France, in Scandinavia. All of these countries are showing our documentaries about the US political or media systems, but they're, because they're not both sides and putting the lie as prominent or more prominent than the truth, we can't get on public television in the country about whom our movies are made.
Well, speaking of documentaries, because it's topical and I want to support journalism, I have to mention, as you raise what we can't show here on our airwaves, that there was a Academy Award winning documentary, No Other Land, that was virtually shut out from any of the main movie theater chains, and I would argue should have been broadcast on one of these networks just to celebrate the storytelling that was being done and what was being shown, and it was entirely frozen out, even as I would argue it fit a mold that the corporate media itself had always imposed on this topic from the beginning, that you have one voice that is Israeli, that you have one Palestinian, and that they balance each other out and they work together in harmony. And that was the nature of this film. Now, you mentioned Bob McChesney, and I have been visiting this book for the first time, The Problem of the Media, going through it. It's been a kind of a guide for me in some of the projects that I'm doing. I started a newsletter in the West Chicago suburb where I'm based. And as I navigate what it's like with this small town government, and I've had to deal with a kind of censorship where they were all of a sudden saying that I had to pay money to use a meeting space in this local library just for the fact that they believed we might be political, since I have some people involved with me who had run as opposition candidates against people before. And that led me to really gravitate towards some of the words from Bob McChesney, and also think of it within the context of where we find ourselves in the, I suppose we'll call it the second cycle of MAGA that has been unleashed upon us, where he really went head on and challenged this idea that journalism shouldn't be political. And in this book, there's this articulation that I wish was more prevalent in our conversations. And I don't know if I have it exactly right, but for what I've come to understand from reading Bob McChesney's work is basically that it's not an issue if you have politics in your journalism. And so often, another one of my colleagues at the Freedom of the Press Foundation will often say journalists just don't really want to be part of the story. And I think that might be true, but I also think that like it's more about what Bob McChesney has his finger on, where it's like they don't want to take a stand and then have to hold to it, that there's like a commitment that comes after you've staked a position that they just really don't want to have to bother with. And so in the profession, they typically steer clear from it. And so as I look at it, I think, more of a problem would be partisanship. More of a problem would be just reflexively always having the same viewpoint, even if something came along that should throw you off of this position. But it's not an issue if you're political. All journalism should probably have some politics, especially in a moment like this, where we've got like a fascist takeover of American cities happening coast to coast.
Yeah, Bob McChesney is one of the great media historians and media scholars. We should point out that in 1996, FAIR was a part of a coalition trying to stop the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which was bipartisan, pushed by President Bill Clinton, a Democrat, and Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, a Republican. And Bob McChesney has written this was utterly corrupt. The act was written by lobbyists for these giant conglomerates. And basically what it did is it allowed the media to get into even bigger and bigger hands, fewer, bigger and bigger hands. And the mainstream media wouldn't cover it. I was writing columns. Why won't the mainstream media cover the run up to what they're trying to pass in Washington? You put your finger on something that most people don't understand, which is that the Society of Professional Journalists has a code of ethics, which is a pretty good one. And you read the code of ethics, the word neutral or neutrality does not appear. The word objective or objectivity does not appear. The words you see repeated are about being fair with regard to how you analyze the facts and how you present the facts. So people have to understand that if you're an ethical journalist who has a strong feeling, as long as the readers or viewers understand your biases, you're completely ethical. If you've made clear, you're transparent, look, I used to be an ACLU attorney. And so on my, I take the civil liberties, that's how ethical journalists act. It isn't that you pretend not to have any point of view on anything. And you believe if you have a Republican point of view, a corporate Democratic point of view, and you don't go beyond that somehow you've been an ethical journalist. No, you've been an unethical journalist. And I'll give you a classic example. National Public Radio in the early 90s, when we were discussing healthcare reform, because of Hillary was appointed by Bill Clinton to be, healthcare reform, and what she came up with was a complete mess, never got out of committee. But a lot of words were exchanged, a lot of bloviating in the media. And on NPR, they would have a former Congress member who's a Democrat and a former Congress member who's a Republican, and they would have alleged debates. And in these debates, both former Congress members, one from each party, would immediately dismiss single-payer national health insurance out of hand. It's not going anywhere, and it would be gone. What they didn't tell their listeners at NPR is that both their former Democratic congressman and former Republican congress member were currently lobbyists or consultants for for-profit healthcare interests who would be undermined if we had universal healthcare. So he had not a clue. So as a news consumer, I'm always telling people, when you hear someone introduced as a retired general or a former deputy secretary of state, they're lying to you, especially when they were formerly or retired general 10, 20 years ago. What's more relevant to the viewer or the listener or the New York Times reader, what are they doing now? What corporate boards do they sit on? And so I remember CNN during Bernie's run for president in 2020, CNN would bring out this guy, Jim Messina, not the singer, but the former Obama official. And they would always introduce him as a former Obama campaign manager, former Obama, I think, deputy chief of staff. And he would come out and bash Bernie. And they didn't tell you that what he's been currently doing for years after leaving Obama, the CNN didn't say he's now a corporate communications consultant for Uber, for Amazon Pharmaceutical, for some of the biggest corporations that Bernie regularly denounces. Now, if he were introduced properly, instead of a former, I tell news consumers, you hear the word former, they're lying to you. If he was introduced, and now we bring on Jim Messina, he's a communications consultant for Uber, for Amazon's pharmaceutical division, for this company and that company. And now it would make perfect sense to the viewers. Okay, this corporate guy hates Bernie because Bernie's with working class and middle class people. At any rate, what people have to understand is that objectivity is a good goal. It isn't necessarily reached when you bring on a former Republican and former Democratic congressman, and you don't introduce what they're currently doing and their current corporate entanglements. But what's most important if you're an ethical journalist isn't whether you feel strongly about something or you're completely neutral about the topic. It's whether you're transparent. NYU, New York University, when the last century was ending, in 1999 or 2000, they did a survey, all of the members of the NYU journalism department and a bunch of outside experts and famous journalists, including right-wing ones. And they went through what are the 100 greatest achievements in journalism of the 20th century. And if you look at the top 10, for example, almost all of them were written by muckrakers or people who had strong opinions about what they were writing. Rachel Carson on DDT. She wrote New Yorker articles. It became the best-selling book, Silent Spring. John Hersey, Hiroshima, about the dropping of the nuclear bomb by our country on that city of civilians. And believe me, and all the others, Lincoln Steffens, these were people that told you what they believed, did factual journalism, fact-checked what they did, didn't exaggerate what they saw. So the importance of ethical journalism is that you reveal your biases and any possible conflicts of interest. That's almost never done in corporate media. It's not done on NPR when these experts have corporate conflicts of interest. You reveal your biases and conflicts of interest, and then you report the news as factually as you can. So yeah, there's all these misunderstandings, including by mainstream journalists. When I started FAIR, I would say to these journalists, you know, why don't you check your bias on these issues? And they say, well, bias, I'm straight down middle of the road. I say, oh, okay. So you're saying you don't have a right-wing bias or a left-wing bias, you have a centrist bias. And they would say, what the hell is it? There's no, how can you be biased if you're middle of the road? I play it straight. And I said, no, I mean, left-wingers, and I include myself, and I've been a left-wing journalist and a very factual one for decades. You know, I generally believe U.S. foreign policy is militaristic, is on the side of big corporations, is overthrows democratic governments if they're anti-corporate. You know, right-wingers believe foreign policy, the U.S. goes around the world capitulating, we aren't militaristic enough. And if you're in the center, your point of view is, well, foreign policy, we sometimes make mistakes, but generally we do the right thing. Centrists have a worldview. Most journalists in mainstream media are centrists, and they think they have no bias whatsoever. I quoted a Democrat and a Republican. I quoted Hakeem Jeffries, and I quoted a Republican, even though they had very little difference on many of the big foreign policy and corporate issues of the day.
It just makes me think of how there was this proliferation in the last decade of these so-called fact-checking operations that would look into media bias. And when I had a media organization, and they picked our organization. It was called Shadowproof, and they looked at it.
I remember it well.
And they did a examination, and they found that we were pretty biased. And I looked at it and I went, okay, but I don't really care because you're confirming that almost all the reporting published was incredibly accurate. So like, to me, I would focus less on the bias, especially if you own that bias. Like what you're saying is, if you own that perspective, which I actually believe that your readers and your audience expect from you, that to actually be a vibrant news media organization is to take up a perspective that makes you more than just this kind of, as the common cliche has been, this view from nowhere, that it's mythical. It's just not really a view from nowhere, but like trying to pretend that you're taking a 30,000 foot view above sea level when you're really not. It's actually more genuine to come out there with your own perspective.
And the view from nowhere is usually a view from the elite.
Yeah.
These people that say, oh, I'm not biased. I quoted a Democrat and a Republican. They believe that they're doing journalism by telling the people what the elites think. Perhaps this faction of the corporate elite and that faction. They don't go to labor union halls and ask people what they think. They don't go to nonprofit public interest groups a lot. They do it a little, as FAIR has shown, very little. But they believe that, you know, their view from nowhere is a view from nowhere, completely objective, when really it's usually laden with official sources, sometimes unnamed, but it's a view from the elite. That's what you get from NPR most of the time, New York Times, Washington Post, the 3 broadcast networks, et cetera, et cetera.
And just because we're rattling off all the things that seem to peeve us, that's how I feel like this conversation has become. There's nothing worse than in the last 5 to 10 years having to sit through these pundits, especially over at the Washington Post itself, equating Bernie Sanders' media criticism to Donald Trump's actual attacks on the work of the media organization, conflating what you and I might do to critique media with actually trying to delegitimize the work of a media organization, which is very fundamentally different.
No doubt. I mean, again, you sometimes hear a middle of the road corporate journalist say, I get criticized from the right and the left, so I must be doing something right. Well, a lot of the critics from the right just believe journalism is communist in general, whereas your critics from the left include some of the most serious academics that have ever worked in a university is critiquing what. So maybe you should pay attention to the serious criticism of what you do, and not, you know, the uninformed, just right-wing blanket name calling that passes as media criticism.
Yeah, or I don't know, maybe I'll be self-interested and cynical here and say if you do it, you open me up to building an audience because people are going to abandon you and subscribe to my independent newsletter. But let's end here with something positive, which I am recalling from your book, but also just I think it bears a lot of relevance to what's happening today. And I'm not asking you to necessarily draw parallels. I just would like you to recall a chapter in your work as an advocate back in 2003. And you referred to this uprising against the FCC when Michael Powell was in. And since we're seeing the same moves to scrap media ownership rules today, even more extreme, in my opinion, why don't you take a moment, just because people all over, just there's just so much happening. It's overwhelming. Where do I plug into? What do I do? But as people might want to wrap their heads around the extremism of the FCC's Brendan Carr, why don't you just talk about the activism that existed in the 2000s here around the FCC?
Yeah, in 2003, when so many people, including you, young people, and by the way, the beauty of young people is they don't read or listen to or watch CNN, cable news and television news and some of these newspapers, their readership and viewership is so old. And young people are overwhelmingly against the U.S. arming Israel to do what it's doing in Gaza. Young people are overwhelmingly for Zoran Mamdani, even though the New York Times was like smearing him and writing editorials about how unfit he is. In the 2003, after the coverage of the Iraq invasion had been so bad and so biased and so cheerleading for this war based on what we learned within weeks, we knew it before the war, was based on lies. And then at that same time, Michael Powell, the son of the Secretary of State Colin Powell, was trying to give more and more media power to these fewer and fewer corporations through FCC rules changes. And when this huge anti-war movement that had developed over the war, and by tuning into Democracy Now! And tuning out on PBS, people knew how bad the media coverage was. And the FCC was going to reward these huge media companies by allowing them to get even bigger. There was a rebellion. And Bob McChesney wrote about it. I wrote about it at the end of my book, Cable News Confidential. It was almost unheard of. There was so much activism. They were melting down the phones and the computers at the FCC. Don't you dare allow these media corporations to get even bigger after the way they led our nation into a war that should never have been fought, that destabilized the Middle East. Yes, there has been media activism a lot, off and on. There will be increasing media activism now. As Bob McChesney, the great media scholar, has always said, no matter what your main issue is, it might be workers' rights, it might be reproductive rights, it might be the rights of immigrants, it might be anti-racism work. Your second issue should be media. It should be challenging media, building independent media, working with other groups to restructure our media system, because the media is doing a bad job on all of these issues. And if every public interest activist understood that media should be their second issue, we'd get somewhere. And I believe, the media reform group that you and I have referenced is called freepress.net. It was founded by John Nichols and Bob McChesney. And another group that does important media research and media activism is fair.org. That's the group I founded. So there's no doubt that we're ready for another upsurge. I would love to see protests outside of the FCC. As you were alluding, there's so many crimes going on every day against different groups, against campus activists, against immigrants, against trans people. It's just hard to for people to keep a focus. But one unifying issue is that corporate mainstream media is a problem, especially these media that are getting warmer and warmer and warmer to Trump every month, because the owners of the conglomerates are getting things they need from Trump. They're scurrying down to Mar-a-Lago. They were in the front row of the inauguration. That's never happened in history. The front row of the inauguration were the people, the CEOs that control our media and information system. Jeff Bezos, Zuckerberg, the guy from Google. It's never happened before. You know, in the 1930s, when Roosevelt was inaugurated, you didn't see Mr. Hearst and Mr. Pulitzer and Mr. Salzberg. You know, they weren't in the front row of an inauguration. So, you know, what that should tell us is, number one, mistrust journalism that's owned by these people. And number two, that we better get active in restructuring the media system, and we better get active in supporting independent journalists. You're an independent journalist that relies on small donations. You don't have big corporations lining up to fund you. So one thing that you do if you're a public interest person, a public interest activist, is you fund independent media because they don't have money for advertising budgets, for marketing budgets. All they have is us to spread the word about them through social media and email, and funding them with our small dollar donations.
Why don't you tell people, because you've got Roots Action up there, why don't you tell people how they could support that if they want to engage in that work?
Rootsaction.org is a peace and justice and public interest environmental organization, independent of the leadership of both parties. It's nonpartisan. You can find it at rootsaction.org. The Media Watch group FAIR is fair.org. All of my work is at jeffcohen.org.
All right, Jeff, it was good talking with you.
Thanks, Kevin. Keep up the great work you do at the Dissenter.